On the night of January 8th, 1993, in the quiet suburb of Palatine, Illinois, winter snow still blanketed the streets. Christmas lights lingered in some windows, and the festive spirit hadn't fully faded. For most residents, it was just another cold Friday night. But within the walls of a small fast food restaurant, something unspeakable was about to unfold. The place was Brown's Chicken and Pasta, a familiar local eatery where families and teens often stopped for fried chicken and fries. That night, the restaurant closed at its usual hour, 9 p.m. The chairs were flipped onto tables, the counters wiped down, and employees were preparing to head home. But someone had other plans. By 10:30 p.m., the restaurant should have been dark and empty. Yet phones started ringing. Family members of employees couldn't reach their loved ones. Michael, one of the workers, hadn't returned home. At first, relatives were told not to worry. Maybe he was hanging out with friends. But unease grew rapidly. Around 1 a.m., the phones at the Palatine Police Department lit up again and again. Multiple families reported missing relatives, all of whom worked at Brown's Chicken. Something was very wrong. 2 officers were dispatched to the restaurant. From the outside, nothing looked suspicious. The lights were off, chairs were stacked neatly. Everything seemed in order, too much in order. But when they tried the back door, it swung open without resistance. Guns drawn, the officers entered. The air was heavy with silence. They switched on the lights and froze. Blood was smeared across the floor, streaks leading toward the back kitchen. Following the trail, they opened the west walk-in cooler. Inside lay 2 lifeless bodies. Shocked, they rushed to open the east freezer. There, stacked like discarded objects, were 5 more victims. 7 people brutally murdered. The officers were left trembling at the sight. What they discovered that night would scar Palatine forever and launch one of the most complex murder investigations in Illinois history. The sight inside the restaurant was beyond horrifying. 7 bodies, some stacked, some sprawled, all silenced in cold blood. The victims included the restaurant owners, Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt, as well as 5 employees: Michael Castro, Rico Solis, Guadalupe Maldonado, Marcus Nelson, and Thomas Menace. Each victim showed signs of execution-style killings. Some were shot at close range. Others were stabbed. The brutality suggested rage, but also cold calculation. Whoever did this hadn't just robbed the place. They wanted to erase witnesses. The officers immediately secured the area. The restaurant was treated as a high-priority crime scene. Evidence technicians worked carefully, but the killers had left little behind. No obvious fingerprints, no clear footprints, no murder weapon. But then, an odd discovery. Inside one of the trash bins was a half-eaten piece of chicken. Grease still clung to the bones, the remains of a meal consumed not long before the murders. Investigators didn't know it then, but this greasy scrap of food would eventually become the key to solving the entire case. Detectives also noted that cash registers had been emptied. This confirmed robbery as at least part of the motive. But if robbery was the sole purpose, why kill 7 people? Why not just take the money and run? The Palatine Police Department quickly realized the scale of the case. This wasn't just another suburban crime. This was one of the largest mass murders in Illinois history. News spread quickly. By morning, TV crews swarmed the area. The media dubbed it the Brown's Chicken Massacre. Parents kept children home from school. Businesses closed early. The entire community was paralyzed with fear, wondering who could have committed such an atrocity and whether they might strike again. But as the days turned into weeks, investigators hit wall after wall. Witnesses were scarce. No cameras had recorded the events. And in 1993, DNA technology was still in its infancy. far from the powerful tool it would later become. The only glimmers of hope lay in the small, overlooked details. That greasy piece of chicken, a few shoe prints in the snow, and rumors whispered among locals. Detectives didn't know it yet, but the killers had already made critical mistakes. In the days following the discovery, Palatine became a town living in paranoia. Restaurants that once bustled with families now closed early. Employees demanded extra security. Parents told their kids never to work late-night shifts. Nobody felt safe. The media's constant coverage amplified the fear. Headlines screamed of the fast food massacre. Reporters swarmed victims' families, searching for details, but answers were scarce. The only certainty: 7 innocent lives had been cut short in an act of unthinkable violence. The police worked around the clock. Hundreds of tips poured in, ranging from suspicious strangers to disgruntled ex-employees. Detectives followed lead after lead, but most ended in disappointment. One tip stood out. A witness claimed to have seen a beige-colored car near the restaurant around the time of the murders. Investigators combed through registration records, questioning dozens of car owners. But without solid evidence, it was like chasing shadows. The half-eaten chicken remained in an evidence bag, sealed and stored. DNA testing existed in 1993, but it wasn't precise enough to build a case. At best, it could narrow suspects, but not confirm guilt. Still, detectives had the foresight to preserve it, hoping that one day science might catch up. As weeks turned into months, the case went cold. Families demanded justice, but detectives had nothing concrete to offer. For the victims' loved ones, the pain was relentless. Michael Castro's parents attended every memorial, begging for answers. Richard and Lynn Ellenfeld's family struggled to keep their grief private as reporters knocked on their doors. The most haunting detail? There was no clear motive beyond robbery. The killers had escaped with less than $2,000. 7 lives, stolen for the price of a used car. Years passed. Detectives retired. Case files collected dust in storage rooms. For nearly a decade, the Browns Chicken Massacre lingered as a grim, unsolved mystery, one that many feared would remain forever unanswered. But then, in the early 2000s, a forgotten clue, the greasy chicken bone, was pulled out of storage. And with it, a breakthrough no one had seen coming. Nearly a decade after the murders, most people in Palatine had resigned themselves to the idea that the case might never be solved. The Browns Chicken Massacre had become a ghost of the past, haunting but dormant. But in 2001, science finally caught up with justice. The half-eaten chicken, stored for years in a freezer, was resubmitted for testing. By now, DNA analysis had advanced far beyond its 1993 limitations. This time, forensic scientists were able to extract a viable DNA profile from saliva left on the bone. When the results came back, investigators had their first real lead in years. The DNA matched a man named Juan Luna, a former Brown's Chicken employee who had worked at the restaurant years before the murders. The discovery stunned detectives. Luna had never been considered a serious suspect before, but now his DNA was sitting at the center of the crime scene. Investigators began digging into Luna's past. He was quiet, reserved, a family man on the surface. But beneath the calm exterior, there were troubling signs. Luna had once been fired from the restaurant. He knew the layout. He knew the routines. He knew the victims. Still, the case needed more. A DNA match was powerful, but prosecutors wanted additional evidence. That's when a shocking betrayal cracked the case wide open. In 2002, a woman came forward, Ann Lockett, the ex-girlfriend of Luna's close friend, James Degorski. Lockett revealed that shortly after the murders, Degorski had confessed to her. Not only that, she said Luna was his partner that night. According to her, the two men had walked into Brown's Chicken, ordered food, then pulled out their guns once the restaurant closed. They forced the employees into the back, robbed the cash registers, and executed them one by one. Lockett's testimony lined up with the evidence perfectly. Luna's DNA on the chicken bone proved he was there. The missing money explained the motive, and the sheer brutality matched Degorski's reputation. Someone known for being volatile, even cruel. For the first time in years, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The Brown's Chicken Massacre was no longer a mystery. It was the work of two men, Juan Luna and James Degorski, driven by greed, anger, and a chilling disregard for human life. But even with the breakthrough, bringing the killers to justice would prove to be a long and grueling process. With DNA evidence and Anne Lockett's testimony in hand, investigators finally had enough to move forward. In May 2002, nearly a decade after the murders, both Juan Luna and James Degorski were arrested. The news shocked the community. After years of silence, the killers were not shadowy strangers. They were men who had walked among them all along. Both had blended into ordinary lives. Luna was married with a child, working quietly to support his family. Degorski drifted between jobs, often described as hot-tempered and violent. During interrogation, Luna initially denied involvement, but detectives pressed harder, reminding him of the DNA that tied him directly to the crime scene. Under pressure, Luna confessed, but later tried to recant, claiming his confession had been coerced. Degorski, on the other hand, never admitted guilt. He maintained his innocence, despite mounting evidence against him. The case moved into the courts, but progress was slow. Defense teams fought aggressively, challenging the reliability of DNA testing, the credibility of Anne Lockett, and the methods used during interrogation. Meanwhile, prosecutors painted a vivid picture of two men who had not only killed for money, but seemed to take pleasure in the slaughter. It wasn't until 2007 that Luna's trial finally began. The prosecution leaned heavily on the DNA from the chicken bone, as well as his partial confession. The defense argued that while Luna may have been present, he hadn't pulled the trigger, but the jury wasn't swayed. After weeks of testimony, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts of murder. Luna was sentenced to life in prison without parole. 2 years later, in 2009, it was Degorski's turn to face justice. Once again, Anne Lockett testified, recounting his chilling confession. Additional witnesses described how Degorski had bragged about the killings, showing no remorse. After a long and emotionally charged trial, he too was found guilty of murder. Unlike Luna, Degorski's sentencing phase was turbulent. Jurors debated whether he deserved the death penalty, but in the end, he was also given life without parole. For the families of the victims, the verdicts brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had finally been served, but nothing could erase the years of pain or bring back the 7 lives lost on that bitter January night. By the time both killers were locked away for life, more than 15 years had passed since the night of the massacre. For the families of the victims, the long wait for justice had been agonizing. Some relatives had passed away before seeing the trials conclude. Others carried their grief like a permanent scar, always wondering what their loved ones might have become had their lives not been stolen in 1993. The community of Palatine was forever changed. For years, the Brown's Chicken restaurant stood as a grim reminder of the crime. Business at the chain plummeted, with some locations across Illinois closing their doors. Customers simply couldn't separate the brand name from the horror of that January night. Eventually, the Palatine location was torn down, leaving only a vacant lot where it once stood. The massacre also forced police departments nationwide to rethink how they investigated mass killings. The foresight to save that greasy piece of chicken, a detail many could have dismissed, proved that meticulous evidence preservation could mean the difference between a cold case and a conviction. For prosecutors, the case became a landmark in forensic history. It showed the power of DNA evidence, not just to link a suspect, but to resurrect a case long thought unsolvable. The chicken bone, once a trivial scrap of food, had become the silent witness that spoke louder than any confession. But the story didn't end there. Years after the trials, James Degorski filed lawsuits against jail staff, claiming mistreatment behind bars. He won a settlement for injuries sustained in prison, a detail that infuriated victims' families, who saw it as an insult that a convicted mass murderer could profit in any way. Meanwhile, true crime enthusiasts, journalists, and documentary filmmakers have continued to revisit the case, dissecting its every detail. For some, it serves as a chilling reminder of how fragile ordinary life can be. For others, it stands as proof that even the most hopeless cases can one day find resolution through persistence and science. Today, more than 3 decades later, the memory of the Brown's Chicken Massacre still hangs over Palatine. At memorials, candles are lit for the 7 who never came home. Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt, Michael Castro, Rico Solis, Guadalupe Maldonado, Marcus Nelson, and Thomas Menace. Their names remain etched into the town's history, a tragic reminder of what was lost. And for those who study crime, the case continues to ask unsettling questions. What drives 2 men to slaughter 7 innocent people for less than $2,000? Could anyone have seen the warning signs? And how many other cold cases still wait in the dark, needing only one overlooked clue to bring them back into the light? The Brown's Chicken Massacre is not just a story of horror. It is also a story of resilience, of families demanding justice, of detectives refusing to give up, and of science finally giving a voice to the voiceless. When we look back at the Brown's Chicken Massacre, it's easy to see only the horror, the cold-blooded executions, the years of fear, the stolen futures of 7 innocent people. But the case also highlights something deeper: the relentless pursuit of justice, even when the odds seemed impossible. For nearly 10 years, it appeared that the killers had vanished into thin air, leaving only grief and unanswered questions behind. Detectives cycled through hundreds of tips, theories, and suspects. Families begged for closure. And yet, year after year, the files sat collecting dust. Many believed the case would join the endless roster of unsolved American tragedies. But justice, in this case, was patient. A single, greasy chicken bone, dismissed by many as trivial, proved to be the deciding factor. It reminds us that in investigative work, no detail is too small. What seems insignificant today may one day unlock the truth. The story also reveals the complexity of human nature. On one side, we see the cruelty of Juan Luna and James Degorski, 2 men who destroyed 7 lives for a handful of cash. On the other, we see the courage of witnesses like Anne Lockett, who risked her safety and reputation to come forward with the truth. Her voice, combined with the silent testimony of DNA, brought justice where none seemed possible. For the victims' families, the pain never fully ended. Trials and convictions could not erase the memories of lost birthdays, graduations, and milestones. Yet, knowing the killers would never walk free offered at least some measure of peace. Today, the lot where Brown's Chicken once stood is empty. Grass and asphalt have replaced the building where the tragedy occurred. For new residents of Palatine, it may appear as just another patch of land. But for those who lived through 1993, the memory of that place is indelible. The case also left its mark on America's true crime history. Documentaries, podcasts, and books revisit it not just because of its brutality, but because of what it represents. The intersection of community trauma, forensic breakthroughs, and the stubborn refusal of justice to remain silent. So, as we close this chapter, we remember the names once more: Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt, Michael Castro, Rico Solis, Guadalupe Maldonado, Marcus Nelson, Thomas Menace. 7 lives, 7 families shattered. One night that changed an entire town. The Brown's Chicken Massacre will forever remain one of Illinois' darkest moments, but also one of its most powerful lessons in perseverance, science, and the enduring demand for justice.